Lord, yes, papi, hit me one time and make it funky.
I was brought up and told to have no fear. I was brought up and told to have no fear. I was brought up and told to have no fear.
Welcome to the Full Circle Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, David Roberts, along with the OG Dr. Neil Holmes and the oral historian, Andre Taylor. Today, we have a very special guest, Dr. Biko Agozino. He is a criminologist. Dr. Agozino, welcome, sir.
Thank you, David.
Now, we wanted to talk a little bit about some of the work that you've done. We know right now you're at Virginia Tech and you're a professor of sociology and Africana studies. You also teach some criminology courses, but we wanted to focus on your criminology background. In 1997, you wrote a book called Black Women in the Criminal Justice System. Now, oftentimes when we talk about the criminal justice system from our perspective, the focus is on Black men because, you say that Black men are being mass incarcerated. What motivated you to focus on Black women in the criminal justice system?
Very good question, David. I grew up in Nigeria and started my academic career there with a degree in sociology. I was also working as an assistant lecturer and starting my graduate studies in criminology before I got scholarships to go to the UK for my master's and PhD. But while in Nigeria, I was also involved in community organizing. And one of the major projects we worked on is something called Women in Nigeria, WIN. And WIN was an organization that allowed men and women to work together to campaign for women's rights to be respected as human rights. And that exposed me to news coverage saying that a lot of Nigerian women were being arrested as drug mules in London and incarcerated. So I decided that there's not a law written about Black women and the criminal justice system. So that was a challenge for me to look at that problem to see what discrimination, what oppression the women were experiencing at the hands of British criminal justice officials. So that was my initial introduction to what you might call feminist criminology, or what we might today call in Africana studies, Africana womanism. So I did my master's long essay at Cambridge University on the topic, and then went to Edinburgh University in Scotland to do my doctoral research on the same topic of Black women and the criminal justice system. What I found is the question you are raising, a lot of resistance by the European feminists who try to discourage me from writing about Black women because I'm a man, and men supposedly wouldn't understand what women are going through. And I didn't buy that, so I resisted the pressure and went ahead to complete the research. It opened my eyes in many different ways, because in criminology, what we talk about in criminology, conventional criminology, is the punishment of offenders. Whereas what I was finding was that Black women did not have to offend before they were, in quote, punished by the criminal justice system. And this goes all the way back to slavery, when if a Black man escaped, then the women who are close to him would be subjected to torture and punishment as if they were guilty by association. C.L.R. James talks about this a lot in the Black Jacobins, especially the initial chapters. And I found that during colonialism in Africa, it was the same. The women were often punished if the men were suspected of doing anything wrong. and escaping. They can run into the bushes. The women didn't run. They stood their ground and they faced the colonizers. Same thing under apartheid. The men were forced to use the pass law to go from place to place. And when they tried to extend it to the women declared war on the pass law, burnt their passes, and demonstrated against apartheid, for which dozens of them were arrested, some killed. And so I was finding similar stuff in London, where the police would raid homes to beat up Black women, sometimes kill them because their sons were suspected as being involved in criminality, and they automatically assumed that they must be hiding their loot in their mother's home or their girlfriend's home or their wives, with their wives or daughters. I didn't find any similar guilt by association whereby Black men were being brutalized because they were close to suspected Black women. I didn't see similar relationships between white women and the law. White women were not being brutalized because they were close to suspected white men. This was something that was unique in the experience of Black women, except in the case of Irish women who were close to members of the Irish Republican Army, IRA. But that was unique in the sense that there was a war going on between the IRA and the British military, whereas Black people in Britain had not declared any war against the British Army, but Black women were being taken hostage and being treated as though they were criminals. Criminology didn't have any theory of victimization as mere punishment or the punishment of the innocent, because criminology was almost entirely, from the European point of view, concerned about the punishment of offenders. So that was the problem that I wanted to understand better. And luckily for me, while I was doing the field work, visiting courts, listening to court cases, interviewing some community organizers, there is a chapter in that book about community organization, organizing community resistance against police brutality. I reread it recently and it was, wow, I didn't know I wrote that. Right, so I bumped into Stewart Hall on the streets of London. That's strange because I saw him on television the previous night and he was talking about the poem by William Blake, Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright, as a metaphor for colonialism. And I was transfixed. I said, how come nobody told me there's such a brilliant Black man in this country? I was annoyed with my professors in Cambridge. They didn't point him out to me. Well, that was because in the UK, the graduate study program assumes that you're a mature student. You can find your own way independently of your supervisors. Nobody's going to tell you, go read this book or go look at that guy. So I said to myself, I wish I would meet this man. Now, that's a very powerful thing for an African to say, because we Africans have a prophetic tongue. That's why our mothers always tell us, be careful what you wish for. And the next morning, there he was. As I went to get the paper, I bumped into him. He was walking down the street. Casually, I started screaming, Prof, Prof, Prof. And he laughed. He said, my friend, what are you doing in London? He must have known from my accent that I was foreign. So I told him, he said, you must come and talk to me about it. His house was next door to where we met, and he gave me an appointment. I went there 30 minutes. He told me I was talking about articulation. I said, no, Prof. You see, articulation is for modes of production. The capitalist mode is articulated with the pre-capitalist mode and disarticulated. He said, yes, you can abstract it from the mode of production analysis and apply it to social relations. So racism uh, sexism and imperialism are articulated, disarticulated, and rearticulated for the purposes of understanding the chances that, for example, Black women have in the criminal justice system, or the obstacles, the oppressions that they face. They're not separate systems of oppression. They are different systems of oppression, but they never separate. They are articulated, disarticulated, and rearticulated. That is what is known in the US as intersectionality. But he uses the Marxist term articulation because he got that articulation from a study of South Africa, where they were looking at capitalism and cheap labor under apartheid to see whether apartheid was simply a system of capitalism or whether it was also a system of racism and sexism against the Black majority. And the conclusion, obviously, is that you couldn't go to the activists against apartheid in South Africa and tell them, oh, comrades, you got it all wrong. This is not about racism, you know. Apartheid is a form of capitalism. It's just the working class struggle. They will laugh at you and say, but comrade, we know that. We also know that it is a racist system and it is also a sexist system. It's not separate, it's articulated. And he gave me a chapter he wrote for UNESCO on that race articulation and society structured in dominance. And that set me straight, since the theory of articulation has always been very beneficial for me in understanding no matter what policy area I'm looking at. And luckily for me, that dissertation was picked up by a publisher after it had been rejected by many publishers who said if it was going to market well, somebody would have written about it. There was no book on Black women and the criminal justice system because maybe it wouldn't sell well. So this young editor said, okay, I'll start a new series with your book and I'll make you the series editor. So that was the bonus. And the book made some impact. People reviewed it to say it was a foundation for what they call the decolonization paradigm in criminology, because criminologists talk about the colonial model from Fanon to say that criminal justice is part of the colonial systems of domination, African Americans being internally colonized, people in South America and Central America also being internally colonized. The internal colonialism thesis can also be found in the fringes of the British Isles, in Scotland, in Wales, in Northern Ireland, where they also felt they were under internal colonialism. But they didn't include in that theory of internal colonialism the struggle for decolonization. And that is what I was bringing in from a different perspective, conceptually, that punishment is also an imperialistic concept that tries to expand and colonize other concepts that are not part of the punitive regime. Things like victimization could be colonized by punishment and make it look as if those who are being victimized are also being punished. Whereas I called for the decolonization of victimization from the expanding empire of punishment. And thirdly, the theories of Habermas will recognize that there is some degree of institutional colonization of the life world by monetary power under capitalism. But he thought that the way to solve that problem is through a dialogic democracy that recognizes the equality of voices of people speaking in comprehension with one another. He did not go beyond that to actually talk about existing systems of colonialism and resistance against colonialism as part of his theory of communicative action. In fact, he said in that book that African systems of communication were pre-civilizational, that they were, well, what did he mean? He said pre-literate. Pre-literate, we invented writing in Africa for thousands of years, tens, hundreds of thousands of years before there was anybody called a European. In what sense could you say African systems of communication were pre-literate or pre-civilization? We are the cradle of civilization. Everybody knows that.
Right.
And so Habermas would say, oh, well, I'm not talking about the history of the world. I'm talking about the history of Europe, Western Europe specifically. And Edward Said said, but you can't do that without talking about slavery. You can't do that without talking about the colonization of the world by Europe. So he didn't buy that, nor did Said buy that from Foucault, because Foucault made the same kind of error of talking about microphysics of power, the power over an individual, and the power by the individual over their own body, the way prisoners, for example, could go on hunger strike to discipline their body as part of their resistance to the prison regimes, but the prison regime would also target punishment at the individual prisoner by putting them in a cell, maybe even in solitary confinement. But he never talked about macrophysics of power, which is what imperialism is all about. It's not a microphysics. It's not targeted at an individual. And the resistance against imperialism and colonialism, even though he talked about the penal colony, the penal colony, but he didn't talk about colonialism. He was writing in Tunis, and he rented the home of the former colonial governor's residence as his place of writing, and he never mentioned this kind of struggle. So Edward Said again said, what was that all about? And Edward Said said that Fanon, Frantz Fanon, is the better theorist for the colonized, because he recognized the anti-colonial struggle as being very important. But also he recognized attempts by Europe to recolonize the world. They are not done with colonialism, so we shouldn't really be talking about post-colonial yet, because they are still actively trying to recolonize us. And therefore the resistance and decolonization should continue until we can see an end to colonialism, maybe through reparative justice, something that Fanon also called for, but as part of the struggle against colonialism. And that's what I saw in studying Black women and the criminal justice system, that the victimization of Black women could be addressed by recognizing that the state, the capitalist imperialist state, has committed crimes against Black women by, for example, incarcerating them in such high numbers that 90% of the Black women in prison in the UK were there for drugs offenses. I'm like, what? If it was white women who were being incarcerated in such huge numbers in Nigeria and Jamaica for drugs offenses, Europeans would have legalized those drugs already, and they would go to war against Nigeria and Jamaica to free their women. Remember, they fought a whole opium war against China for the right to sell opium to Chinese. So I called for the legalization of those drugs and their regulation. And this was in 1997. It wasn't already happening. It wasn't already happening when I was called on my African friends. Said, Biko, you're crazy. They're going to fail you. I said, well, let them try. It's my dissertation or thesis. That's what they call it, doctoral thesis. And I'm going to defend it. And I did. So I'm happy I did. And I'm happier to see people in the community today organizing to push back the arms of the nanny state and legalize drugs so that people can use their own will to choose what to consume in their own home without posing a threat to other human beings, especially because tobacco and alcohol that are legal kill a lot more people than something like marijuana, for which they use as an excuse to incarcerate, arrest, and criminalize large numbers of people of African descent in North America and across Africa and the Caribbean and South America, even though we do not use drugs as much as white people. We don't have the money to spend on drugs, period. You know, white people get a lot of spare cash from grandpa and grandma, and pocket money from mom and dad. So they got money to spend, and they're spending it. About 2/3 of the users of crack cocaine are white. And yet, the vast majority of those who are arrested and tried for crack cocaine are Black in North America. In America, 81% of those tried are Black, but 2/3 of the users are white. So that was part of the reason we contributed to advocacy and pressure on Governor Northam to change the law in Virginia, legalizing marijuana instead of waiting until 2024. Allow people to use it now if they can find it, or grow their own if they can find the seeds. Don't continue to give the cops the excuse to discriminate against otherwise law-abiding African Americans for something that is safer than tobacco, something that doctors want to prescribe as medication for chronic pain, compared to the opioid crisis that killed 92,000 Americans last year and 500,000 in the past 10 years. Marijuana never killed anybody. Why is it illegal? So that's part of what I said in that book. Going back now, thinking about it, I must have been a little crazy to run my mouth, but I was convinced that what I was saying was right. And history has proven it right.
Let me ask you a sort of a follow-up kind of a question. You know, in the U.S. itself, this idea of domestic colonialism or internal colonialism was at the core of Black power, of the Black power. All the advocates of Black power, no matter where they came from or what wing of it they belonged to, believed in this idea of the internal colony. And in fact, you know, looked at the police as sort of an occupying army and so forth.
Yeah.
So I have a kind of a double question. From 1980 to 1983, we see this level of incarceration of Black folks in this country go up about 10 times.
Yes.
And so what in this period do you believe that the state, that it was, that is those forces of policing and prisons and all that stuff, what was pushing them toward this higher level of incarceration? What would they, why was it getting ramped up? Because throughout our experience here, we've pretty much been at a certain level, except right after slavery, or right after Reconstruction. To kill Reconstruction, we had criminalization of Black men in particular.
Yes.
And then all of a sudden you remove all these folks out of the political sphere and out of the economic sphere as free or semi-free operators. So what was happening in the 70s to 80s that moved the state to this very high level? I mean worldwide, extraordinary levels of incarceration of our people.
That's a tough question, and I must admit that I haven't thought about it the way you are posing it, in terms of the increased incarceration and mass incarceration as something that emerged after the initial successes of the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement. There was a counterintelligence operation that was launched against the Panthers and against the civil rights movement. Everybody knows that. But that may not be enough to explain the intensity of prison boom construction and the reliance on incarceration rather than education as the tool for the reform of society. My guess, and I might be wrong, is that a lot of brothers were coming back from Vietnam, were coming back from Korea. These we are trained killers, armed, the veterans, and there was a fear that that type of professional violence could penetrate into the wider community, and white people were not comfortable with that. So maybe the increased intensity of the war on drugs that Nixon launched in 1972 was an excuse to mop up the surplus working population and the poor and incarcerate them so that those who own capital will feel safer and continue to grow their wealth in the US without a lot of threat from the unions that were also under attack for what they call the right to work. Here in Virginia, we don't have a right to unionize in the universities because it's a right to work state, right? But it's not simply class politics. Like I said earlier, when we look at South Africa, it's also racism that is entrenched in the very structure of the United States as a settler colonial location that committed genocide against the Native American Indian natives, stole their land, and introduced racialized chattel slavery for hundreds of years, for which they have never apologized and for which they have never offered to pay any form of reparations to people of African descent. So those might be part of it. I'm sure they are part of it, but also then the gender element of it should not be forgotten, because the vast majority of the active community organizers in the Panthers, we are Black women, right, from what I hear. And also, those Black women, we are very strong in advocating for Black men too. They were not engaged in gender separatism the way European feminists were. They have always recognized that racism was an important problem, not just for Black men, but also for Black women. Whereas white women thought it was only sexism that was a problem and saw Black men as a threat. Susan Brown Miller and others, Against Our Will, the book, we are talking about Black men as potential rapists, for which Angela Davis responded in Women, Race, and Class, that white women should not allow themselves to be used as an instrument against Black men, to terrorize Black men and Black women, because rape was almost always an allegation by white men against Black men that they saw as rivals to the interests of their women. And according to the case of Furman v. Georgia in 1976, there was evidence that almost 90% of those who were executed for rape in America from 1936 to 1996 were Black men. And there's no way Black men were committing 90% of the rapes in America, right? It was as a result of racism that is entrenched in the criminal justice system and in the consciousness of the average white person, that any Black man who was accused of raping a white woman would be automatically assumed to be guilty. Bill Cosby, for example, right? Anyway, the problem goes further than 1970s. I think it was part of the Jim Crow problem that ran Black people off the land, so their land, farmland could be seized by whites. It was part of the opposition to Black Reconstruction by even poor whites who were burning down schools in Virginia, intimidating teachers who came to educate people of African descent, without realizing that the Black initiative calling for the public expenditure of public funds to support education for all was not only for the benefit of Black people, but also for poor whites to go to school. They didn't know that. And so that old Jim Crow is still present in the new Jim Crow, according to Michelle Alexander, that the war on drugs became the instrument that was used to make sure that a lot of the poorer Black people and a lot of poor white people too, and Hispanics were locked up and the kids were thrown away in order to offer a sense of safety to the white majority. But it wasn't really working. It wasn't really working because it did not stop the inflow of drugs into the communities. And along with the drugs came a lot of violence that followed the drug trade and the war on drugs. So it was actually Black communities that campaigned and accused Congress of ignoring a potential genocide that came with the crack epidemic and the drive-by shootings, New Jack City and Boys in the Hood type of stories. Mm-hmm. So when a college student from University of Maryland, Len Bias, died of a drug overdose, they thought he died of crack cocaine overdose. Turned out to be powder cocaine. The pressure was put on, according to Joe Biden, on him by the Black community to say, you got to make this demon drug more punitive if anybody is found with it, make it 100 to 1 punitive so that we can stop our children and our families from being destroyed by this epidemic. The Nation of Islam would police neighborhoods to drive away the fruits of Islam, would drive them away from their neighborhoods. Yes, so maybe there was a campaign from the Black community against the impact of the violence that went with the illicit drug trade. But the Black community have been calling for things like reparations forever, and they never did it for us just because we called for it. We've been calling for free education at all levels. We've been calling for jobs and housing. Come on, the only time you're gonna listen to us is when we say, come on, we need to lock up some bad eggs. Well, I understand that even today, when I challenge some of my colleagues to support the call for the legalization of drugs, because the drugs do less harm than the prohibition and the violence that goes with the prohibition. If the drugs are legalized, we can use education rather than prohibition to get a lot of young people to say no to the drugs. And education works better than prohibition. That was the lesson we learned from alcohol prohibition. So it's a multifaceted problem. And Jeffrey Ryman in The Rich Get Richer and the Poor Get Prison explains it this way. He said, those lawmakers are not demons. Some of them at least have good intentions to promote public safety by toughening sentencing and the war on drugs and things like that. It's just that what they are doing is making the matter worse, and they could continue to do the same thing and hoping that a different result will come out, but they're picking up relatively nonviolent drug possessors and locking them up in prison for months and years with hardened criminals. And before they come out from those prisons, they've been recruited into prison gangs. The only associates they know are people they met in prison. Nobody will give them a job because they committed felonies, and nobody will give them housing. How do you expect they're gonna survive? This is the question that Michelle Alexander was asking in the new Jim Crow, to say that she didn't believe it either initially. When this was brought to her knowledge, she thought, well, if you do the crime, you should do the time. But then she started studying it and she found, oh my God, this is a systematic system of racial injustice. That's the word she uses, racial justice, to talk about the new Jim Crow. But it's actually more than racial justice. It's also a gender injustice to Black women whose incarceration increased 800%, whereas the incarceration of women generally increased by 400%. The increase rate for Black women in America was double, 800%. And it was not just racial justice, injustice, the way Michelle Alexander puts it, it's also class injustice, because there are a lot of poor white people in prison too. If they knew that, it's just that they don't know it. They think the prison industrial complex and system of domination is only against Black people. If poor white people knew that the police kill more white people than they kill Black people, they will be out in greater numbers to support the Black Lives Matter movement. That was what Steve Hall was trying to get at with its theory of articulation, that when you have authoritarian populism, say under Thatcherism or Reaganism, it would not affect only Black people, you know, it will also affect a lot of poor white people. So we need to build coalitions and alliances in our struggles against these system, intersectional and articulated systems of oppression. Because injustice anywhere, as Martin would say, is a threat to justice everywhere. So I don't have an answer to that question that you posed. It's a book that you should probably write to explain to us where this type of irrational policy making is coming from. Is it simply to make a profit from locking people up? Is it simply because of what Jeffrey Rahman called Pyrrhic defeat theory? You are defeated, but it costs you so much to be defeated in the war on drugs that you still continue the war? Or is it simply irrational policy making? Nobody knows for sure, but it is something that we need to start. And I think that is the more important question. How do we struggle to decolonize the criminal justice system, abolish the use of prisons? For example, given that our ancestors, indigenous people, never had prisons for tens of thousands of years, and they had more peaceful communities until they were conquered and colonized by Europeans who imposed the repressive fetishes of European modernity on everyone else. We can go back to abolishing prisons. Say in South Africa, why are they locking up Jacob Zuma? If he stole money, recover the money. But you don't have to lock up a freedom fighter when the people who caused apartheid are walking free and enjoying the wealth that they stole from the people, the apartheid gold, the apartheid diamonds, the land. 87% of the land is still in the hands of the land grabbers who stole it. And you're locking up Jacob Zuma, not because he did anything wrong, nothing has been proven against him, but because two Indian brothers were suspected of committing fraud against the people of South Africa. And you lock up Jacob Zuma. That doesn't make sense to me.
It doesn't. Let me go back to something else something you mentioned. You mentioned before African civilizations had no prisons. Now that's really intriguing to me. How did they deal with like a murderer or a rapist?
Yes, if you kill somebody's son, you give them your own son. So it is reparative justice. Well, rape is a difficult one to address because in indigenous societies, if you rape a woman, the punishment is you marry the woman.
Okay.
Now that wasn't very fair to the woman, right?
Right.
You know? But the assumption is that you destroyed the woman and nobody else will marry her now that you've raped her. So you're now going to have to marry her. But I don't think that's fair to the woman to have to live with a rapist for the rest of her life. So in other words, the indigenous criminal justice system is not perfect.
Right.
Right, but it was a more humane system of correction than what we have under capitalism. It doesn't mean we're going to go all the way back to what was there 100, 200,000 years ago
Right.
before there was anybody called a European. But we can do without prisons. The vast majority of prisoners are non-violent, and under capitalism, you see the drug companies that made the opioid that killed 500,000 Americans, they're not going to jail.
Right.
They are going to settle it through a fine. They're going to pay $4 billion chicken feed compared to the profit that they made, but nobody's going to jail. Why don't you apply the same principle even to the poor? So if you steal or rape, no, maybe rape is a violent offense for which you could still be locked up, but it would be a very small prison system for violent prisoners, okay? But if something like commercial economic crime would be treated by giving you a job and garnishing your wages to pay back what you stole. That is how they deal with crimes of the powerful and crimes of the state. No government, no country has ever been sentenced to death or to prison. Why don't we apply the same principle to crimes of the poor and less powerless? That is what Marx suggested with commodity fetishism, that under capitalism, the commodity form becomes the dominant form of exchange. And Marx was borrowing this language from Africans, you know? Mm-hmm. Yeah, because fetishism that he's referring to, mm-hmm. He actually called it an African system of religion. I think he called it social hieroglyphics. The value of commodities, he said, was a mystery, a magic to classical economists that needs to be deciphered all the time. He called it a hieroglyphic. And hieroglyphic is an African system of writing by ancient Egyptians, am I right?
Yes, sir.
Yes, I think he also called it necromancy. Necromancy is an African system of divination that Europeans borrowed from Africa, didn't acknowledge it. That is the foundation of what we know today as algorithms. They came from those numerology that they borrowed from Africa. The Europeans did. They confessed it openly. You know, somebody like George, well, I don't want to go into the mathematics of it, but that was what Marx was saying, that a table is a table. Only under certain conditions does it become a commodity that is given a value. The people are confused. They think that value is divine, is spiritual. The value of the table, no, Marx said. The value of the table is determined by the amount of labor it took to build the table. It doesn't have any inherent value in itself. The gold dug up in South Africa has value because it takes a lot of labor to go miles under the Earth's surface to get the gold. That's why it has so much value more than ordinary pebbles on the surface. Marx was channeling African knowledge all the way, and he mentions Africans by direct reference hundreds of times in Das Kapital, which is an acknowledgement that he was learning from us. And he said so. He said to European workers, study the African struggle against slavery and for emancipation, because the same way they struggle to win emancipation from slavery, that is how you're going to struggle for emancipation from wage slavery. He's talked about it almost every chapter in the book, but it's hidden to many Africans who simply reject Marxism as another European system of thought. Marx wasn't really a European. He was a Jew, expelled from country to country. And of course, Jewishness is an identity that emerged from Africa. I'm not stretching the ethnic connection, but I'm saying there is an acknowledgement that he was borrowing from African knowledge systems in his own thought. And he made it explicit throughout the book. So if we apply that theory of commodity fetishism that he borrowed from Africa to the crack cocaine, powder cocaine disparity, you find that this is what the lawmakers we are doing. Joe Biden thought that crack had more value as a demon drug, that it was 100 times more addictive than powder cocaine, and therefore it should be punished 100 times more. But it is simply the same cocaine. It's the same chemical compound and didn't have any more spiritual powers. It didn't have any necromancy or numerology to give it more punishment. But overall, this is how capitalism thinks about law enforcement and punishment. They think about it as a commodity. So if you do the crime, you have to pay the price. You have to pay the price that is equal to the crime that you did. That is, the punishment has to be calibrated to equal the pain caused by the crime. But this same principle is not applied to the crimes of the capitalist firms and the capitalist states, the Nazi states, the apartheid state, the colonizing states. It's only applied to the relatively powerless. What if we took the principle that since the crimes of the powerful are not dealt with punitively, we should use the same principle in dealing with all crimes by moving away from punishment towards reparative justice, so that we can try to repair some of the damage done to the people victimized, rather than obsess about exacting the price of the crime from the offender. Now, this was the promise of socialism and communism, that the state, the capitalist state, would be abolished and the worker state would then wither away along with the criminal law. The criminal law would also wither away and be replaced with administrative law, so that we would take from all according to their abilities and give to all according to their needs, something that Marx got from the New Testament. It's in the Bible, so right. Yeah, but that hasn't been done in any country, but that doesn't mean we couldn't do it. South Africa tried to do it with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, to say no matter what crime you committed under apartheid, just come and confess it and all will be forgiven. We're not going to try to punish you. So that is Truth and Reconciliation. And Botha said he wasn't going. He held the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in contempt. And Mandela said, well, we forgive you anyway. And that was the end of it. But what Mandela and Tutu left on the table was justice. So they had truth, they had reconciliation, but they didn't have justice for the Black majority who still don't have their land back, who still don't have their apartheid gold back, and still don't have the right to go to school at all levels without paying a fee under the New South Africa. So those are the kinds of problems that arise when you adopt the commodity as the ultimate value of everything, including human beings, to the extent that Africans were traded as commodities. And Marx was saying a Negro is a Negro. Only under certain conditions does it become enslaved, become a commodity.
Now, Dr. Agozino, you've given us a lot to think about, especially one of the points that stood out for me was when you said that we asked for a lot of things and didn't get those things.
No.
I used to say that, I used to use that same excuse. I used to say, we asked for police to be harder on crack cocaine because it was tearing up our community. And you made a good point. We asked for reparations, we asked for certain things, but we only got that, something that hurt our community. Now, with the little bit of time we do have left, because I know there's no way to capture like everything that you probably captured in both of your books on this podcast. Can you tell our listeners and viewers how they can get your book, Black Women in the Criminal Justice System, that was published in 1997, and the other one that was published in 2003, Counter-Colonial Criminology?
Oh, thank you. I'm happy to say that Black Women and the Criminal Justice System was republished by Routledge in 2018 because Routledge bought Ashgate. So they're reissuing some of the books in my series, including Black Women and the Criminal Justice System. It's still a little pricey because it's in hardback. They haven't issued a softback version of it. But Counter-Colonial Criminology is in softback, so it's less expensive. It's from Pluto Press in London, progressive publisher in London. Now, the way you get those books, if you don't have a lot of money to spend on books, is you ask your local library to order the books for you. You know you can do that? Well, you pay taxes. The libraries are there, why people are using it, they order books through those libraries. You can do that too. Just go in, tell the librarian, I want to read this book. You don't have it. Can you order it for me, please? Please. They will order it. They are using our tax money to do so. And if you work in a university, it's even easier. It's called interlibrary loan. Any book or article or chapter that you want, just walk into the library and request for interlibrary loan, you will get it only in a matter of days. But also, increasingly, a lot of my works are available online. So if you type in my name, you'll find articles that I wrote for the African Journal of Criminology and Justice Studies at University of Maryland, Eastern Shore, where the journal is housed. It's all free access. And we are beginning a new series with Virginia Tech publishers to publish books that are open source, that is Creative Commons. They're not they are free. If you want to buy a physical copy, then you may have to order it from Amazon and help that guy go back to outer space and stay there. Next time he goes, because in outer space, you don't have to pay taxes, and he doesn't pay any taxes down here either. Right, so our books from Virginia Tech Publishing will be free. We just released a book there on community policing in Nigeria, because there is a lot of violence in Nigeria, and we do not know who is instigating these violent attacks against our people, whether it is imperialism that is interested in controlling our oil wells through a minority of rulers who would seize power and govern in the interest of international capital. We don't know, because we're not going to drink the oil. We're still going to sell them at the international market value. There is no need to maintain a fascistic regime in neo-colonial Africa just so you can get your hands on oil or gold or diamond. Right, but that is what is happening in Nigeria. Lots of school children are being kidnapped for ransom. People are being killed by the military in very large numbers. The police are doing this thing. The young people are out on the street demanding for an end to militarized policing. But those police officers are trained here in America and in Europe and armed to go back and kill our people. Why? Nobody knows for sure. So our book looked at community policing as a concept that you can critique, say in North America, where they call it community-oriented policing, COP. But because of Black Lives Matter, we know it's not working because they are using what they call community-oriented policing to penetrate the communities and still continue to kill the people in very large numbers year after year. Same in Brazil against our people. Same in the Palestine, where the Israelis claim that they have success with community policing, but the Palestinians wouldn't agree because the Palestinians still don't have a state. Whereas if they had a federal republic of Palestine or Pal-Israel, where they have one state solution for everybody, the Jews, the Palestinians will share in that state, the same way the United States of America is a federalist solution to that kind of exclusion, racist exclusion of some. Maybe you can begin to think about community policing working. You can't say it works in South Africa, the way the police are mowing down young people for demanding freedom for Jacob Zuma, or in Nigeria, where there is no state police, no local police, only a federal police force, armed and trained by the colonial authorities in London to kill our people. So we're calling for a return to the way we used to police our communities thousands of years when we didn't have an armed police force, we didn't have prisons, and yet we had more law-abiding communities.
That leads me to my last question. I don't know how much time we have, and but this question of colonialism. Usually the answer to colonialism is some sort of liberation and building a new state, and maybe like you're talking about a state of a new type, or you know, and Kwame Nkrumah said that he said we cannot go back to the past, but we can go back and get the values of the past. And he says there's some very important values of the African past that we have to develop. But he also said that in order for us to, and when he was talking about us in this country, he was saying that, he said that in this book, Class Struggle in Africa, he said Africans in the United States are in fact what he called a domestic colony. And in order for us, he said, to have a national, we won't have a national home, he said, until Africa itself is united and liberated and etc., socialist. So how does that, how does his ideas work in terms of something for us to work for in this decolonization? Not only we getting rid of something, we have to build something new, and not just one institution, but something that the institution is part of.
Yes, I agree with Nkrumah. That was the message of Du Bois. That was the message of Garvey. That was the message of Fanon and Walter Rodney, that Africa has to come and reunite rather than maintain the boundaries that were imposed on Africa by the colonizers. Are we being clever or what? I mean, 50, 60 years after we regained our political independence, we are still defending the imaginary lines that a few Europeans drew on the sand and using them to exclude fellow Africans and impede our movement across Africa. So the African Union Commission that Muammar Gaddafi led was aimed to erase those borders and have a union government that would include the diaspora as a sixth region. In other words, African diaspora could have dual citizenship, just like other diaspora populations, so that they can come and go with an African Union passport, something that has now come into place. They now have an African Union passport, and they have an African Free Trade Commission, where they are building it up towards becoming a confederacy that will still retain the colonial boundaries. And we are trying to persuade them to go beyond the confederacy and have the People's Republic of Africa united democratically, so that we don't respect those colonial boundaries. Why? Because the poor people don't respect them. They're all over Africa looking for food, looking for work, looking for beautiful sisters and brothers to marry, looking for education and business opportunities. That's what they millions of people are doing across Africa. It's only the few elite who benefit from the military aid that is given to them by imperialists are the ones who are interested in keeping Africans divided along those. So I agree with the Pan-Africanists with Nkrumah. That was the critique that Fanon made about Cote d'Ivoire. Because under Houphouët-Boigny, the Africans who came to Cote d'Ivoire to work in the cocoa farms were regarded as guest workers. Fanon said, what kind of guest workers do you mean? We gotta let Africans come as full citizens. We need to erase these colonial boundaries. And Boigny said, no, they're guest workers, because in that part of Africa, the dominant principle is matrilineal descent, not patrilineal descent. So if your mother is from Burkina Faso, you are not truly Ivorian, even if your father is from Ivory Coast. So that was called disqualified Ouattara from running for president because his mom is Burkinabe. They fought the whole war, 10 years over that kind of stuff. Fanon was saying that that type of national consciousness becomes a bottleneck to African unity. Because even after the foreigner was forced to leave, the Europeans will begin to fight among ourselves to determine who is truly Ivorian. They called it Ivorite, truly Ivorian. And they fought a whole war over that. Whereas if we have the United States of Africa, just like the USA, or the People's Republic of Africa, just like China, or even Australia to some extent, or Canada, Africans can move from state to state without any need for a visa or passport. The African economy will boom, and our unity will be so strong that no individual autocrat or imperialist will ever try to dominate us again. So yes, Nkrumah was right, Azikiwe was right, Mandela was right, Fanon, Rodney, Du Bois, they were all right. We got to do it. We got to form our party or revive Nkrumah's party and have branches all over Africa in every state, and use our party, the same party in every state, to campaign for the victory of the decolonization struggles against the legacies of colonialism and imperialism on Africa. That's what is lacking now. We're doing a lot of talking. We're not party building. That is what Nkrumah said we should do. We should build our party. That's what Mandela did to fight apartheid. He built a party. That's what Azikiwe did to free Nigeria. He built a party, and I think Du Bois joined the party too. So that's where we're dropping the ball. We don't have a party. It's not just going to be a movement or a podcast. We got to begin to organize the democratic party that will lead Africans to unity and to triumph over imperialism for the benefit of the whole world. Because white supremacy is a threat to humanity, not just to Africans.
Well, Dr. Agozino, again, you've given us a lot to think about, and that was a very powerful piece there. And so I do, we want to close it out, but I would like to have you on again, because I'd like to, I'm sure Dr. Holmes agrees, we'd like to explore that. I'd like to do a whole podcast on building that party and unifying Africa and how we could, move forward with that. So I would definitely love to have you on again, if you'd be willing to come on and talk with us again.
With pleasure. I would love to come back. Yes. Thank you for inviting me.
Again, we thank you for joining us. Again, it's been very enlightening to me. I'm like almost at a loss for words, some of the things I've learned. So again, thanks for coming on. and we look forward to having you again.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you, David, for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
No problem.
Lord, yes, papi. Hit me one time and make it funky.
I was brought up and told to have no fear.